we very much need opportunities like today to come together and bridge the sectors and to recreate in our work the kinds of overlapping and interacting ways that people experience these issues. So the relationship between violence and homelessness for young people is multifaceted. But there are three key themes that we want to focus on that emerge in our work. They're young people's experiences of parental and other family violence as a driver of homelessness, young people's intimate partner violence experiences as a driver of homelessness, safety issues or power and control or because of eviction as a result. The third type is one that receives relatively little focus in the literature, in the policy papers or in the broader conversations, and that's intimate partner violence experienced during homelessness, and how the dynamics of these two experiences are mutually compounding and create both elevated vulnerabilities and barriers to support. You might have noticed that we use the term intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence, and that's a really conscious choice. It's designed to be inclusive of relationship violence that occurs outside of the spatial definition of a home. So the term domestic defines violence as being the home space in which it occurs. So intimate partner violence or relationship violence we use because they're much more inclusive of the experiences of young people who experience violence during and around homelessness. So in our work with young people, we see the three key themes, and it's really clear that we need to do a lot more research to understand the complex dynamics of these experiences. But we also see that these experiences intersect and interact with each other. And young people can experience one, two, or all three of these themes in distinct, successive, or overlapping ways. We also see that experiencing one of them, like family violence, for example, much increases your chance of experiencing one or more of the others. So the first theme focuses on family violence as a trigger for homelessness. And I know that many of us in this room are unfortunately going to have a wealth of case experience to draw on for this issue, and this is a great case study that was provided by Kate from Reconnect. And young people are often without very many options when home becomes too unsafe, and child safety may not be aware or may not have capacity to respond, particularly for older teenagers. So young people enter homelessness because it appears to be the safer option when home becomes a place of violence. The intersection between family violence and homelessness is really clearly supported by BYS data that shows that 68% of young people presenting at our homelessness support services report past violence in their family home. 21% tell us it's current. As well as violence and trauma being an immediate trigger for homelessness, however, there are also longer-term implications, of course, that intersect with reduced capacity to sustain that stable housing. With such high rates of trauma and violence during the developmental years, it's not surprising that more than half of the young people who come to BYS have already been diagnosed with mental illness. Most commonly depression, anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. 53% of the young people presenting with a diagnosed mental illness are currently homeless. 1/3 report suicide risks and 1 in 5 tell us that they self-harm. And we've got psychologists who do assessments that clearly link these mental health issues with severe life stress and show that whilst we can work on reducing the impact of the symptoms of anxiety and depression, they're really not able to be resolved until we can improve people's life circumstances. And it's abundantly clear in research and in our practice, therefore, that the longer-term impacts of family violence contribute to ongoing barriers to safe and stable housing. Moving on to the second theme, intimate partner violence as a trigger for homelessness. Now, BYS sees alarmingly high rates of both current and past intimate partner violence across all groups of young people, whether housed or homeless. Over half of the young people in primary and secondary homelessness report prior experiences of intimate partner violence. And rates of IPV are about 70% for young people now living in government or community housing. So an important point that we really want to emphasise today is that young people have their own relationships, and those relationships are too often violent. Research shows that young women under 25 experience relationship violence at significantly higher rates than older women. There's a common social assumption that young people are predominantly impacted by violence perpetrated by the adults in their lives, by their parents and carers and those in their family homes. And that the misconception that young people's relationships are not really serious can really undermine our capacity to identify and respond to intimate partner violence in their lives. Negotiating intimate relationships is a key developmental process for young people. So service providers across these sectors, we need to have a clear expectation that young people, even in their early teens, are going to be at as much risk, if not more, of IPV than are adults. Excuse me. We know at VYS that our data is going to be a big underrepresentation, because we collected at that first point of meeting, and we haven't developed the trust yet at that point. But also, often young people don't identify their experiences as intimate partner violence. Or they know, as we're going to talk about a bit more later, that if they say that they're experiencing violence, then that becomes a barrier to accessing homelessness accommodation services. And yet, given all that, we still see that 7 in 10 tell us they've experienced violence in an intimate relationship. 1 in 4 actually tell us that they're using violent or intimidating behaviour themselves. And 40% who are coming for homelessness support say, yes, please, I would also really like help with violence. And importantly, when we look back at this table, we need to really pay attention to that third theme, the pattern of current violence across all groups. So we can see that for young people who are currently homeless, 16% of them tell us that they're also experiencing intimate partner violence. And we know that's going to be highly underreported for all of the reasons that I just talked about. Co-occurring intimate partner violence and homelessness is really complex, and it's really problematic for both the homelessness and the domestic violence sectors. So it's here that we'd really like to focus some attention today. I'm going to hand over to Ashleigh now. She's going to talk a bit more about hands-on practice experience, and then I'll come back to you afterwards.
Okay, so thanks, Rhianon. I'd like to start by sharing the words of Alice, who's a young person who we supported at QYHC. So when someone is experiencing homelessness, they're highly susceptible to DV, as they may feel that they are alone except for their partner, that they are only loved by their partner despite the DV, and that they are safer with them than alone. Being homeless without their partner can actually open more doors for safe support and housing. Alice shares here some key issues for us to be aware of in our work. In particular, Alice discusses the profoundly isolating experience of homelessness. When young people feel alone and without support networks, they're more vulnerable to violence in their relationships. Many young people, like Alice, have reported feeling as though their abusive partner is the only close relationship in their life. Alice also points out the double-edged sword of being in a violent relationship during homelessness, in that young people may feel reliant on abusive partners for protection from the other risks of violence common in homelessness. And this is a common story for young women and LGBTIQ young people. Young people often fear physical and sexual assault whilst homeless and may seek out or stay with partners who are known to be violent or intimidating in order to protect them from violence perpetrated by other people. Due to this, young people describe having to choose between the dangers of being homeless on their own and staying with an abusive partner. And thirdly, Alice identifies that violent relationships can compound homelessness by being a barrier to accessing housing. Young people also talk about the way that in homelessness there are no doors to lock or windows to bar. They may have no safe place to go while homeless. Young people need to use the same spaces and be connected to the same communities as their partner. Lack of money prevents people from leaving the area, and DVOs provide limited protection without a fixed address or when living in public spaces. For those reasons, it's even more dangerous for people who are homeless to attempt to end a violent relationship. Young people's situations are also sometimes misunderstood as primarily a homelessness issue, rather than a domestic violence concern, preventing their access to DV refuge. Those under 18 are often unable to access DV refuge, but young people may then also be turned away from youth accommodation services for simple lack of beds or because of a concern that the service is not equipped to meet the potential safety issues related to intimate partner violence. And young people in their older teen years are often impacted by a lack of child safety capacity to find safe accommodation. It's an ongoing and critical issue that young people under 18 are falling through the gaps between homelessness, DV and child safety services, meaning that they have little choice but to remain in a situation of co-occurring homelessness and violence. The vulnerability of homelessness can also exacerbate and reinforce the power and control dynamics that operate within relationship violence. Alice described it well when she identified it as how her past experience of violence and current homelessness made her much more vulnerable to her partner's manipulation. The intersection of homelessness and IPV often creates a mutually reinforcing and compounding set of risks. With barriers to accessing DV refuge, homelessness accommodation services are not always a safe place for someone experiencing intimate partner violence. The service may not have sufficient security or capacity to keep people safe, and street addresses of youth accommodation are often publicly known. This is not necessarily a critique of services, and in both sectors there are clear resourcing limitations that create barriers, but the result is that young people have nowhere to go. Being a worker in this space can be challenging, with significant practice and systemic issues to contend with, and some key considerations include that the first place a young person experiencing intimate partner violence presents at is usually not a DV service. Therefore, it's important that screening for violence occurs across all sectors. In situations of frequent high demand and limited resourcing, homelessness practice may focus primarily on sourcing housing and overlook potential safety or violence issues. A housing-first approach should not blind us to complex co-occurring issues. Couples presenting together are another challenge for homeless service providers, and the person using violence may control how their partner accesses support, such as whether their partner can see a worker on their own, how much time they might spend with the worker, and what they can disclose. The worker may be aware or unaware that this is occurring. And it's important that organisational practices encourage individual appointments as a standard practice. This is essential when there is any form of known or suspected violence present in a relationship. And as Scott said, we need to take account of the power imbalance in all of our actions. Given the stats Rhianon showed, we also need to assume that this could apply to any young couple accessing homelessness support. When couples access services together, it can be difficult to make a sound assessment of the complex dynamics of intimate partner violence. My experience is that this can result in assumptions that violence goes both ways or is mutual, particularly in cases where it may appear that both parties use violent actions. We should be wary of making assumptions about mutual violence without in-depth assessment of the dynamics of gender, power and control, self-defence and acts of resistance, and this is consistent with what Scott spoke about earlier. Finally, when violence is an issue, we need to be prepared to engage in brief or opportunistic interventions. And this might include setting up code words or phrases in advance, inviting young women for a women's health check, or other pretexts to get young people alone without elevating risk. Finally, in homelessness and youth services, we also regularly work with young people using violence, and according to Rhiannon stats, it's 1 in 4. It's important that we're able to offer the person using violence a service whilst prioritising the safety of the person experiencing violence. It can be really tricky to engage a young person who is using violence whilst maintaining strength-based practice, empathy, and a position of holding them accountable for their violent behaviour. The work requires a depth of skill and professional support that may not always be available across or outside of the DV sector. And as Scott talked about, it's really important that we avoid colluding with the person using violence. And it can be particularly difficult if violent or controlling behaviours are used in the presence of a worker. In these moments, we need to find a safe way to acknowledge and respond to this behaviour without excusing it, or making the person experiencing violence unsafe. As a homelessness worker, this can be really challenging, but the risk is that a lack of response to violent behaviour results in us inadvertently normalising the behaviour or polluting. With safety as the first priority, workers need to be supported and prepared to adapt our responses appropriately. This could include moving support to alternate spaces or limiting access times for a person using violence to ensure that their partner has a safe place to seek support. And while there is indeed a lot of violence in homelessness work, it's important that we don't fall into the trap of becoming desensitised or to inadvertently normalising violence as just part of the homelessness experience. And I'd like to finish now with Alice's advice. Alice has kindly shared her experience with us to help us learn and develop our responses to young people experiencing the unique challenges of intersecting intimate partner violence and homelessness. Alice reminds us to hold true to our strengths-based purpose and continue to advocate with young people for their right to be safe and free of violence. I'll let you have a read of Alice's quote and hand back over to Rhianon.
It's safe for you to be housed with people of the gender you identify with, but it's traumatic to be housed with a gender that is not who you are. Ongoing research that we've been doing at BYS has raised concerns that young women and LGBTIQ young people are particularly negatively impacted by trading sex for a place to sleep, with patterns of very poor mental health, suicide and self-harm as a result. And then there are the range of barriers created by involvement in the criminal justice system, by disabilities, by mental health issues, and of course very complex interactions with culture, with colonisation and displacement, with our First Nations people being, as the Minister acknowledged, highly overrepresented in homelessness and at much greater risk of being killed by an intimate partner. There are cultural complexities for refugee communities displaced in Australia, potentially facing not only language and culture barriers, but many layers of trauma, stereotyping and misrepresentation. There are so many mutually compounding issues that require us to have a really strong inclusive practice that cuts across the many layers of intersectionality that exist in people's lives. So, where to from here? Our first step, we believe, needs to be a strategic strengthening of the services that exist within this space. We cannot work effectively in this complex and challenging space when we've got small teams dealing with dozens of new young people every day and too few safe accommodation options for them. We need more people, more beds and more capacity to respond to the immediate needs so that we can create the space that we need to then deal with the complex intersectionality. Youth services need greater capacity to respond to both intersecting issues. Homelessness services need better safety systems and sufficient resourcing to keep all service users safe. The DV sector needs more capacity to respond to the specific needs of young people, particularly those under 18, and to be inclusive of those who are experiencing current homelessness. We would argue that while better collaborative practice is a priority, it's not going to fill a gap created by simply not having enough resources to meet the needs. But as we do build capacity, we can also focus on better intersectional and collaborative work. Opportunities like today are a really great platform and a wonderful opportunity to develop better service integration. As Scott said, having consistent definitions and understanding of the problem is critically important. We would like to see more work across the sectors in sharing the skills and professional development training. We need hands-on practice guides that will frame and guide our intersectional responses, that prioritise safety agency and capacity for change. Homelessness workers are in particularly complex positions in working on housing issues with both victims and perpetrators of violence. Without systemic support to be able to effectively address the risks of violence, it's not just a safety issue, but it undermines long-term housing outcomes. The sector also needs greater capacity for early intervention and more access to harm reduction strategies like healthy relationships programs, trauma counselling and legal advice. The Housing First strategy has great strengths and benefits. However, in the case of high-risk intersectional issues like violence, we need to be aware of not being blinkered but holding on to a concurrent safety-first focus. Christine at Northwest Youth Accommodation Services shared with us some great case examples of what can happen and how it can be managed. A short excerpt is on this slide. Scott talked about women having to leave and losing their home and security, and this case was a really great example of the way that the service worked to allow Casey to stay in her home, and her partner was then relocated to another form of housing. The earlier and more effectively that workers across both sectors can identify and address all of the risks of violence and risks of homelessness, the more effectively we can prevent both from becoming barriers to long-term safety and security. And finally, while there's so much more that we could say, with better shared frameworks for cross-sector practices, we can move towards more shared casework between homelessness and DV services, so that young people aren't bounced from one to the other, creating gaps for them to fall into, but are held by both services concurrently and consistently. To do this, we need to acknowledge violence as a trigger for homelessness, but we also need to acknowledge homelessness as a space of violence. And of course, we need to be working on a whole of community response that accommodates the multiple layers of intersectionality that exist in people's lives. Both violence and homelessness are underpinned by intergenerational, systemic and sociocultural patterns of disadvantage, trauma, gender and broader power imbalances. As Scott said, we need to change the system. We need to use young people's experiences as our starting point. If we can work together on turning conversation into real action, and of course do a lot more research to really understand and build an evidence base for that action, then I think today can be the start of creating real change. Thank you.